Hey all, this is Dr. Johnson, and I'm going to do a quick lecture for you on Tom Regan's article, The Radical Egalitarian Case for Animal Rights. So let's go ahead and look at the conclusions that he is proposing at the beginning of the article. So Tom Regan argues for three things: the total abolition of the use of animals in science, the total dissolution of commercial animal agriculture, and the total elimination of commercial and sport hunting and trappings. So just to let you know, if you look at these three things that he is arguing for, what you will notice is that if we enacted his proposals, these things that he thinks we should do, this would indeed promote quite a radical change in society. So what it would mean is there wouldn't be any more animals used for science, for testing various cures or various medicines or surgeries or that sort of thing. And it would also mean that there wouldn't be large-scale animal agriculture like raising chickens or pigs or beef or cows for food. And then furthermore, it would mean that we couldn't hunt or shoot or trap animals, for instance, for fur or for food or for clothing or, for instance, for zoos, that sort of thing. Now, my point here in telling you that is not to tell you that you either should believe in Regan's goals or not believe in them. It's merely to point out that he's arguing for quite a radical change in how we treat animals in our society. So one question we might ask is, what is the evidence, or what are the reasons he's giving to support this conclusion? So first, Regan points out to us that he thinks that the way we treat animals currently in our society is wrong because we treat them as a resource. And so why might it be wrong to treat people or animals as a resource? And Regan says that when we treat animals as a resource, we are denying them any rights. And if we think about the question, well, why do people deny animals rights? Regan thinks that one of the most common answers to that question is to point out that some people, even a lot of people, believe that we only have indirect duties to animals. And what that means is that, for example, if your neighbor kicks your dog, that means they've wronged you, not your dog. So it's not that kicking the dog itself is a problem. Rather, it's that your dog belonged to you and they messed with your property without your permission, for instance, or for your consent, or without your consent. So one implication then, for instance, of this indirect duty view to animals is that it would mean that if an animal doesn't belong to anybody, then it seems that we don't have any duties at all, either towards the animal or to anyone else, because the animal doesn't belong to anybody. And that would mean perhaps that we could do what we wanted with the animal. That is one possible implication of this indirect duty view towards animals. Regan asks us to think further about the basis of this indirect duty view towards animals. And he suggests that there might be two reasons that people have this indirect duty view. So first, they might argue that animals don't feel anything at all. And because they don't feel anything, that means we really don't have to care about so much how we're treating them. But that claim that animals don't feel anything pretty much seems completely implausible to anybody who's spent even a small amount of time around animals. And so probably all of us have experienced animals crying out in pain when somebody stepped on their fur or foot, or they got hurt in some way. And we also know that it seems that animals get frightened about things that are threatening to them. And certainly that fear is probably somewhat instinctual and biological, but it seems to be rooted in this understanding that animals have that something can hurt them and they want to avoid that. So that doesn't seem plausible to say that we don't owe any duties to animals because they don't feel anything. But let's even imagine that animals, let's say this. Let's say that we argue, okay, perhaps animals do feel something. Perhaps they do feel pain. But we might argue only human pain matters. And so still we don't have to worry about animal pain. Well, there's a problem with this reasoning. On what grounds could we argue that human pain is the only pain that matters? So remember, if we're trying to be an ethical person, we want to have ethical reasons for doing things. And that means that we're acting on principles or virtues that are aiming at some kind of good, higher good for ourselves and others. And our reasons have to make sense. So again, the question is, on what grounds could we argue that human pain is the only pain that matters? Now again, we might be able to make a case that human pain is more significant than animal pain. So for instance, we might be able to say, because human beings have a more complex emotional and thought life than animals, they experience pain at a much deeper level and it can be more profoundly damaging to them. So perhaps that's why we care more about human pain than animals' pain. And fair enough, let's say we do believe that. Well, but surely it seems very hard, even based on that view, that human pain is more significant. It still seems very hard to make the case that animal pain and suffering is entirely unimportant. And what we should note is that if we care about relieving suffering in the world, it seems we should care about animal suffering. So again, if we are hoping to develop some kind of environmental ethic, that means that we're hoping to care about the environment in some way. And it's really difficult to care about the environment if you don't care about the pain in the environment and the suffering felt by members of the environment. So Regan asks us to consider that when people try to justify this indirect duty view to animals, one of the ways they try to justify it is through the theory of contractarianism. Contractarianism suggests that moral rules only apply to beings capable of being moral. And the argument goes, since animals are not capable of moral reasoning, we don't have moral responsibilities to them. So people who argue for contractarianism, they will often suggest that it's hard to understand how we could owe moral responsibilities to beings that, first, cannot dialogue about morality with us, cannot reason about morality with us, and thirdly, actually do not hold themselves to moral standards either because they cannot dialogue or reason about morality. So contractarians will ask, how could we have moral duties to such beings who don't engage in any kind of moral reasoning themselves? And on first glance, that argument seems somewhat convincing, but there is a problem with it. Contractarianism, the way I have explained it, not only seems to suggest that we don't have moral duties, owe moral duties to animals, but that we also would not owe moral duties to human beings, like certain human beings, like the very young who can't engage in moral reasoning, very old people or people with cognitive impairment like dementia and Alzheimer's, or people with brain injuries or severe learning disabilities who are not able to engage in moral reasoning and dialogue. So again, if I can back up here, if the gist of contractarianism is that moral rules only apply to beings capable of being moral, well, that seems to not only suggest that we don't owe duties to animals, but also to a lot of human beings. And Regan believes that that's unacceptable. All right, so Regan argues that the indirect duty view relies on contractarian thinking, which fails. So it seems we must have some kind of direct duties to animals, and the question might be, what are those duties? So some people believe that the way we can best explain our duty to animals is to say that we have a direct duty to be kind to animals and to not be cruel. And granted, this seems like a step up from contractarianism and the indirect duty view. So maybe we are inclined to say, yeah, that certainly must be our responsibility towards animals. But Regan actually believes that this view is insufficient as well, insufficient to fully inform our view of how we should treat animals. And the reason why can be best illustrated with the question, how do I know that a kind act is the right kind of act or that a non-cruel act is right? And Regan gives two examples to illustrate the point in this question. And he gives a thought experiment of the generous racist and the kind abortionist, which I'll explain briefly. So imagine somebody is a racist and they definitely hold racist views and believe that certain ethnicities and racial groups are much less inferior than others. And so, for example, let's say that this racist donates a bunch of money to a school that is an all-white school, and he is specifically donating this money because he wants to further and advance the education of white children only. Now, granted, on the one hand, we might say, well, people get to give their money or give their money wherever they want to give it. And on the one hand, that's pretty much the case. But remember, what we're asking here is, how do we know when an act is kind or a right kind of kind act? And what Regan is pointing out here with the generous racist is that on the face of it, the generous racist actions of giving money to this school actually seem to be very kind acts. He's giving all this money. But when we look at his underlying motivations, we actually find that this act, which seems kind, is actually not a kind act. Or here's another example. He gives the example of the kind abortionist. Now, by the way, I believe that Regan at this point is coming from the viewpoint that abortion is, in most cases, morally wrong. And I'm not asking you today to hold any kind of moral view about abortion. But just for a moment with me, would you just imagine that abortion in most cases is morally wrong? Let's say that that is so. What Regan is pointing out here is that you could have a person who is an abortionist who is performing what seems to be morally wrong acts. We're just assuming right now that abortion is most of the time morally wrong for the sake of this thought experiment. And Regan's point with this is to say, well, you could have an abortionist who is kind and is doing kind things, like maybe when he is performing abortions, he's treating the patients that he is working with very kindly and gently and with great politeness and humanity. But nevertheless, we could look at his act and say, well, but that act isn't right on this reading of this thought experiment. So the point is that just saying don't be cruel and do be kind, it doesn't seem to be a sufficient enough rule to let us know if somebody actually is doing the right action. Okay, so Regan suggests that the cruelty-kindness approach towards animal duties, our duties to animals, is not adequate. And he says another view that people often will adopt towards animal rights issues is the utilitarian approach. And there are two principles, maybe, that utilitarians might use to figure out how to behave towards animals. They might say everyone's, including animals, interest counts. And the second principle might be do the act that maximizes happiness and minimizes pain for the most people. And actually, not even just the most people, for the most creatures. So in other words, with animal rights, we could say, so look, a utilitarian approach toward animal rights counts the interest of animals as well as human beings. And given that everyone's interest counts equally, we need to do the act that maximizes happiness and minimizes pain for the most people. And so somebody with a utilitarian approach to animal rights might say, this will actually help us figure out well how to treat animals well and minimize their suffering. But Regan's problem with utilitarianism is that it focuses on satisfaction rather than inherent value. And he gives another thought experiment, Ant B, to help flesh this out. And he says this: what if I have an Ant B? I'm putting it in question form and kind of summarizing it myself. What if I have an Ant B who is rich and old and actually really mean? Regan uses the word cranky. No one likes her. And when she dies, I will inherit her money. And I have planned, in order to get a tax write-off, that I will donate a great deal of this money to a children's hospital, that'll work to cure a host of children's diseases and help children's and their families' lives be better. Well, this will make so many people happy and bring so much satisfaction. And in fact, we could say that me doing this would bring so much more happiness and satisfaction than Aunt Bee's life currently does. Because remember, she's just really mean and nobody likes her, whereas everybody likes little kids and wants to see them be well and not suffer anymore. So the problem here is that Regan believes that utilitarianism, which tells us to maximize happiness and minimize suffering, does not have a good argument for why I should not kill Aunt Bee. And his point here then is to suggest that utilitarianism can't be a really good guide towards animal rights either, even if, and I'll back up a slide here, we start off with the principle that everyone's interests, including animals, counts. He still fears that it's not an adequate basis for figuring out our duties to animals. So, and here's a final part of his article, Regan suggests a different way that we should approach animals. He suggests that we develop this idea of inherent value, that all beings have inherent value and deserve to be treated with respect. And he says we can't limit inherent value just to humans. How could we do it? And the reason he asks this is because he says, how could you prove that only humans have value? Again, if you try to say something like, well, humans have value because they can reason, they can use some kind of analytical thinking, and they can communicate. Well, we can actually point to numerous examples of animals who display some kind of analytical thinking. Ravens and some primates seem to be especially good at this. And we can also point to a lot of human beings that don't seem to demonstrate analytical thinking very well. And so the point is, any criteria we would use to try to say, well, this is why human beings have value and animals don't, we're going to run into those same problems, that actually some animals seem to show that same criteria, that ability expressed by the criteria, and some human beings don't. So Regan thinks that it's really impossible to limit inherent value just to humans. And so that's why he concludes inherent value then belongs equally to those who are the experiencing subjects of a life. And that's why he believes, and I'm going to go way back to the beginning, that is why he believes we have to abolish the use of animals in science, we have to dissolve commercial animal agriculture, and we have to eliminate commercial and sport huntings and trappings. All right, thanks for listening to this lecture. Feel free to write if you have any questions.